Your fingers can't move. That's the first thing you notice, not the cold, not the dark, but the fact that when you try to lift your hand to your face, it doesn't happen. Something heavy is sitting on top of you, pressing down from every direction at once, and the air you're breathing is thin and wet and tastes like nothing, because it's not air anymore. It's the inside of a snowbank. You are buried, and somewhere above you, maybe 6 feet, maybe 10, there's a sky you can't see and a world that doesn't know you're still down here, still breathing, still alive. This is not a story someone told secondhand. This happened to a man named Elias Cobb in the winter of 1972 in a mountain pass in northern Montana. And what he did in the 3 weeks that followed is one of the most extraordinary documented survival accounts of the 20th century. Elias was 34 years old, a trapper and part-time mail courier who made his living moving between remote outposts that the regular postal routes couldn't reach. He knew that stretch of mountains the way most people know their own street. He'd crossed it dozens of times in every season, and he'd never once needed rescuing. On the morning of January the 8th, he set out with his mule and a sled of supplies, heading toward a logging camp 11 miles north. The sky was clear, the forecast, such as it was in those days, gave no warning. But mountain weather doesn't ask permission, and by early afternoon the wind had shifted. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in under an hour, and what started as light snow became something else entirely. A whiteout so total that Elias later said he couldn't see his own hand at arm's length. He did what any experienced mountain traveler would do. He found the lee side of a rock outcropping, unpacked what he could, and dug in to wait it out. That decision almost certainly saved his life. What happened next almost ended it. The storm didn't stop. It ran for nearly 40 hours straight, dumping what meteorologists later estimated at 6 to 7 feet of new snow on top of an already deep base. Sometime during the second night, while Elias was huddled against the rock with a canvas tarp pulled over himself for insulation, a wind-loaded cornice above him let go. It wasn't an avalanche in the dramatic roaring sense people imagine. It was slower than that, a slab of packed snow shearing away and sliding downhill under its own weight, gathering material as it went, until it reached the outcropping where Elias was sheltering and buried him, under an estimated 8 feet of snow. He didn't lose consciousness. That detail matters because it means Elias experienced in real time the exact moment his world went from difficult to what should have been fatal. Here's what almost nobody survives. Burial itself isn't usually the killer. Suffocation is. Snow that has just slid and settled is initially porous enough to allow some air exchange, but as body heat melts the snow immediately around a person's face, and that meltwater refreezes, it forms an ice shell, sometimes called a breathing hole collapse, that seals off the air supply within minutes. Rescue teams and avalanche researchers have a grim statistic they use. After 15 minutes of full burial, survival odds drop below 90%. After 35 minutes, they fall below 30%. After 2 hours, survival without an air pocket is considered essentially impossible. Elias had an air pocket, not by design, by the accident of how the canvas tarp had been positioned over his upper body when the slide hit, creating a small void in front of his face. It was luck, the kind that separates the survivors interviewed decades later from the names that appear only in incident reports. But an air pocket bought him hours, not days. And this is where the story stops being about luck and starts being about what a human mind and body can do when there is no other option. His arms were pinned, but his right hand had ended up near his chest, close enough to his face that with agonizing incremental effort, inches at a time, over what he later estimated was several hours, he was able to work it upward, not to dig out. The snow above him was too dense, too deep, and he had no leverage. What he did instead was widen the air pocket. He pressed his palm against the packed snow near his mouth and nose, breaking the forming ice shell before it could seal over and over, every time his own breath began to refreeze the barrier. This became his first job. Stay alive one breath at a time by physically preventing his exhaled moisture from sealing his own tomb. The cold was the second enemy, and it worked faster than most people realize. Snow is an excellent insulator against ambient air temperature, which is part of why avalanche burial victims sometimes survive longer than exposure alone would predict. But body contact with packed, wet snow still pulls heat away relentlessly. Elias later described losing sensation in his feet within what he guessed was the first 6 hours, and losing it in his hands not long after, despite the work his right hand was doing to keep him breathing. He began to understand, somewhere in that first day, that conventional rescue wasn't coming quickly. No one expected him at the logging camp until evening, and even then, a missed courier in a storm like that wouldn't trigger an immediate search. Mountain routes were delayed by weather constantly. Best case, someone might start looking in a day or two. Worst case, considerably longer. So Elias made a decision that avalanche survival experts, when they later studied his account, called almost unheard of. He stopped trying to escape and started trying to last. He rationed his own body's resources the only way available to him, through stillness. Every unnecessary movement burned calories and generated sweat, and sweat in that environment was a death sentence, wicking away what little core heat he had left. He forced himself into long stretches of near total stillness, moving only the one hand required to keep his airway clear, and he used the mental discipline of counting seconds, then what he guessed were hours, to keep his mind from sliding into the kind of panic that burns through a body's reserves in minutes. 3 weeks is the figure his account settles on, though Elias himself admitted the timeline blurred badly after the first several days. Without light, without any way to track a sun he couldn't see, his sense of time became something closer to guesswork stitched together from hunger cycles and brief stretches of sleep he couldn't distinguish from unconsciousness. What kept him from starving outright in that window remains one of the more debated details of the case. Elias claimed he had a small tin of dried meat and a water skin within reach of his mobile hand, and supplies from his sled that had, by chance, ended up close enough to access. Rationed at almost nothing per day, it was enough to keep his organs functioning, though barely. Some later accounts speculate the true duration may have been shorter than 3 weeks, that shock and hypothermia distorted his memory of the timeline, but the search and rescue log and the eventual state of his body when found are consistent with an extended burial measured in weeks, not days. The turning point came not from Elias himself, but from the same mule he'd been leading. The animal had bolted before the slide hit, and out of instinct or something closer to loyalty, it hadn't gone far. It circled the general area of the outcropping for days, refusing to move on despite the storm's aftermath. When a search party organized by the logging camp finally reached that stretch of mountain, nearly 3 weeks after Elias failed to arrive, it was the mule, still stubbornly pacing near the buried slope, that drew their attention to a location that no one would otherwise have searched. They found a small, telltale patch of yellowed, compacted snow near where the animal wouldn't leave, a subtle sign of repeated breath and body heat cycling through the same small area for weeks. Probing revealed the air pocket. Digging revealed Elias, alive, severely frostbitten, dehydrated to the edge of organ failure, but conscious enough to speak when they reached him. He lost portions of several fingers and both feet to frostbite in the months that followed. He never fully regained sensation in his hands. But he lived, and in the decades after, his account became a foundational case study for Avalanche survival researchers studying the outer limits of human endurance under burial. A data point that shouldn't exist by the normal statistics, and yet does. What Elias's 3 weeks under the snow demonstrates isn't really about luck, even though luck gave him the air pocket that made everything else possible. It's about what happens after the luck runs out. When a person has to choose, again and again, hour after hour, between panic and discipline, when the body is screaming for one option and the mind has to force the other. Most survival stories end quickly, one way or another. Elias's didn't end for 3 weeks. In the dark, in the cold, with nothing but a hand near his own face and the discipline not to move it more than he had to. He never went back to that mountain pass. But every winter, when the first heavy snow started falling, people say he'd stand at his window for a long time, just watching it come down.